Across the mountains and forests of the American West, a silent catastrophe has been unfolding for years, one that most people never see and few fully understand. Standing in the great forests of California, of the Rocky Mountains, of the Pacific Northwest and the interior West, are tens upon tens of millions of dead trees, gray, brittle skeletons of pine and fir that once stood green and living. Now killed by drought and disease and the slow, grinding pressure of a warming climate. In some accounting, the number of dead trees across the region's forests reaches into the hundreds of millions, a staggering toll of mortality that has transformed vast stretches of the western landscape. And every one of those dead trees is fuel. Dry, dead wood standing and fallen across the forests represents an immense reservoir of potential fire, a tinderbox on a scale that is genuinely historic, waiting for the spark and the conditions that could turn it into catastrophe. It is a danger that has been building quietly for years, tree by tree and hillside by hillside, growing larger with each drought-stricken season. And it now hangs over the entire region as one defining hazard of the era. This is the story of how the West forests came to be filled with the dead, why those dead trees represent such a profound danger, and what it means for a region that has already been enduring some of the worst wildfire seasons in its history. It is a story about drought and beetles and heat, about the slow death of forests and the fire that death makes possible, and about one of the great environmental challenges facing the American West. The scale of the dying. To understand the danger, you first have to grasp the sheer scale of the tree mortality that has swept across the western forests, because it is a scale that defies easy comprehension. This is not a matter of scattered dead trees here and there, the ordinary background of any forest where individual trees die and fall as part of the natural cycle. This is mass mortality, the death of trees not one by one but by the millions, across entire mountain ranges and vast forested regions, in some places killing the majority of the trees across large areas and turning green forests gray. When you fly over parts of the western mountains, you can see it from the air. Great swaths of forest that have gone from green to rust red to gray. Whole hillsides and valleys of dead and dying trees stretching to the horizon. A landscape of death written across the mountains on a scale that is almost impossible to take in from the ground. The counting of these dead trees has become a grim exercise in tracking a catastrophe. Surveys of the western forests, conducted from aircraft and satellites and on the ground, have documented tree mortality running into the tens and hundreds of millions of trees, with the totals climbing higher as the years of drought and stress accumulate. In some of the hardest hit states, the estimates of dead trees have reached well over 100 million, and across the broader West, the cumulative toll is larger still. These are not abstract numbers. Each represents a real tree, once living, now dead and dry, standing or fallen in a forest that has been transformed by its death. And critically, the dying has not stopped. It has continued year after year as the underlying conditions persist, adding to the accumulated toll and deepening the reservoir of dead fuel across the landscape. The scale of the dying is what makes this a historic tinderbox, not a local problem, but a regional transformation. Tens of millions of dead trees spread across the forests of the West, all of it dry, all of it flammable, all of it waiting. Why the trees are dying. The mass death of the western forests is not a mystery. It is the product of a set of interlocking causes that have come together with devastating force, and understanding them is essential to grasping both the scale of the tinderbox and why it has grown so large. At the root of it all is drought, the prolonged, severe dryness that has gripped much of the West for years. Part of a broader drying of the region driven by a warming climate. When drought settles over a forest, it stresses the trees, depriving them of the water they need to survive. Trees, like all living things, need water, and when the soil dries out and the rains fail year after year, the trees begin to suffer, weakening as their access to moisture dwindles. A tree under severe and prolonged drought stress is a tree fighting for its life, its defenses depleted, its vigor sapped, and in the worst droughts, many trees simply cannot survive, dying outright from lack of water. But drought does not act alone, and this is where the catastrophe deepens, because the drought-weakened trees become vulnerable to a second killer, bark beetles. Bark beetles are tiny insects native to the western forests that bore into the bark of trees to feed and reproduce, and under normal conditions, healthy trees can largely defend themselves against them, using their sap and their vigor to repel or drown the invading beetles. But a tree weakened by drought loses this ability to defend itself and becomes easy prey. And here the warming climate delivers a second blow, because the same warming that intensifies the drought also benefits the beetles directly. Warmer winters, with fewer of the deep, sustained cold snaps that once killed off large numbers of beetles, allow more of them to survive from year to year. Warmer temperatures overall allow the beetles to reproduce faster, to complete more generations in a season, and to expand their range to higher elevations and further north than before. The result has been beetle populations exploding to epidemic proportions, vast infestations that sweep through the drought-weakened forests, killing trees by the millions. The combination is lethal and self-reinforcing. Drought weakens the trees. The weakened trees cannot resist the beetles. The warming climate supercharges the beetles, and the beetles finish off the trees that the drought had already brought to the brink. Together, drought, beetles, and heat have produced a mass mortality event of historic proportions, and the dead trees they have left behind are the fuel of the tinderbox. From dead tree to deadly fuel, to understand why all these dead trees are so dangerous, you have to understand what happens to a tree when it dies, and how a dead tree becomes fuel for fire in a way that a living tree is not. A living tree contains a great deal of moisture. Its wood, its needles, its bark are all suffused with water, and that moisture is a powerful check on fire. Because wet or moist vegetation is far harder to ignite and far slower to burn than dry material. A living, healthy, well-watered forest resists fire to a significant degree precisely because it is full of moisture that must be boiled away before the wood can burn. But when a tree dies, it begins to dry out. The moisture leaves the wood and the needles. And over time, the dead tree becomes bone dry, its wood cured into something far more flammable than it ever was in life. A dead, dry tree is in effect seasoned firewood standing in the forest, ready to ignite and burn with an intensity that living wood cannot match. Multiply this by tens of millions, and you have a forest transformed into a vast store of dry fuel. The dead trees change the very nature of how fire behaves in the forest. When a fire enters a stand of dead trees, it finds an abundance of dry, ready fuel, and it can burn hotter and more intensely than it would in a living forest. The dead needles that fall to the ground create a dry, flammable carpet. The dead branches and the standing dead trunks provide fuel that carries flame upward and outward, and as the dead trees eventually fall, as they do over the years following their death, they pile up on the forest floor, creating dense accumulations of dead wood, heavy fuels that can burn for a long time with tremendous heat, and that make a fire extraordinarily difficult to control and extinguish. The transformation of a living forest into a forest of the dead is thus a transformation of the forest's fire behavior, from a landscape that resists fire to a landscape primed to burn intensely. This is the essence of the tinderbox, the conversion, across vast areas, of moisture-rich, living forest into dry, dead, highly flammable fuel, all of it accumulated and waiting for the conditions that would set it alight. The standing dead and the fallen dead is worth understanding that the danger of the dead trees evolves over time, passing through phases that present different but compounding hazards, because a dead tree does not simply stand as a static piece of fuel, but changes as the years pass after its death. In the immediate aftermath of a tree's death, especially in a beetle-killed forest, the tree may retain its dead, dry needles, which turn from green to red as the tree dies. This red phase is particularly dangerous in one respect, because those dead but still attached needles are extremely flammable, and a stand of freshly beetle-killed trees with red needles can carry fire rapidly and intensely through the canopy, the dry needles igniting explosively. This is a period of heightened crown fire danger, when the dead trees are most able to carry fire high and fast through the tops of the forest. As more time passes, the dead needles fall away, and the trees become gray skeletons, standing dead trunks stripped of their foliage. These standing dead trees, called snags, present their own dangers. They remain as tall columns of dry wood that can burn, and they pose a severe hazard to firefighters because standing dead trees are unstable and can fall without warning, especially once fire has weakened them further, making the areas around them extraordinarily dangerous to work in. A forest of snags is a forest full of falling hazards, and firefighters must often avoid working directly in heavily beetle-killed stands for exactly this reason, which limits their ability to fight fires in those areas. Finally, over the years, the standing dead trees fall to the ground, accumulating as heavy dead wood on the forest floor. This fallen dead wood represents a different kind of fuel, not the fast-igniting fine fuel of dead needles, but heavy fuel that burns slowly, intensely, and for a long time, generating tremendous heat and making fires difficult to fully extinguish, sometimes smoldering for extended periods and reigniting. The accumulation of this heavy fallen fuel builds up over the years following a mass mortality event, so that the fire danger from a beetle-killed forest evolves and in some ways persists and deepens for a long time after the trees first die. The tinderbox, in other words, is not a single static thing, but a changing hazard that shifts and in some respects grows more dangerous as the dead forest ages and the fuel accumulates on the ground. Fire in a landscape of the dead. When wildfire strikes a landscape filled with dead trees, the result can be fire behavior of extraordinary and dangerous intensity, and understanding this is central to grasping why the tinderbox is such a serious threat. A fire burning through a forest full of dead dry fuel is not the same as a fire in a healthy, living forest. The abundance of dry fuel allows the fire to burn hotter, to release more energy, and to grow more intense, and this intensity has cascading consequences for how the fire behaves and how difficult it is to fight. A more intense fire generates more heat, which can drive more extreme fire behavior, including the generation of the fire's own winds and, in the most severe cases, the towering convection columns and fire generated weather that make large fires so dangerous and unpredictable. The dead fuel also affects how the fire spreads. Dry dead needles and fine fuels ignite easily and carry fire rapidly, while the heavy dead wood on the ground provides sustained, intense burning that keeps the fire going and makes it hard to stop. The standing dead snags can carry fire upward and can throw embers, and the overall abundance of fuel means the fire has more to consume and can sustain itself over larger areas and longer times. All of this makes fires in beetle-killed and drought-killed forests more difficult and more dangerous to fight. The intensity can make direct attack on the fire impossible, forcing firefighters to fight it indirectly from a distance. The falling snags make it hazardous to put crews into the affected areas. The heavy fuels make the fires burn long and hard and resist extinguishment. And the sheer scale of the dead forests means that fires can find vast expanses of ready fuel to burn across. The tinderbox, when it ignites, does not produce ordinary fires, but fires of heightened intensity and difficulty. Fires that can grow large and behave extremely. Fires that test the limits of the firefighting resources arrayed against them. This is the danger made real, not just that the dead trees might burn, but that when they do, they burn in ways that are especially destructive and especially hard to control. The threat to communities and watersheds, the danger of the tinderbox, is not confined to the forests themselves, because the West forests are not empty wilderness, but landscapes threaded with communities, infrastructure, and the watersheds on which millions of people depend. When the dead forests burn, the consequences reach far beyond the trees, into the lives and livelihoods and water supplies of the people of the region. This is what elevates the tinderbox from an ecological concern to a threat to human society across the West. Many communities in the West are situated in or near the forests, in the zone where development meets the wildland. And these communities are directly threatened by the prospect of intense fires burning through the dead forests around them. A community surrounded by tens of thousands of dead trees is a community living beside an enormous store of fuel, and an intense fire in that fuel can threaten homes, lives, and entire towns, forcing evacuations and, in the worst cases, causing the destruction that has become tragically familiar across the West in recent years. The dead trees also threaten infrastructure, the power lines, the roads, the facilities that run through the forests, both as fuel that can carry fire to them and as falling hazards that can bring down lines and block routes. And perhaps most importantly, for the largest number of people, the dead forests threaten the watersheds that supply water to the cities and farms of the West. Many of the region's water supplies originate in the forested mountains, where snow and rain are captured and released into the rivers and reservoirs. When those forests burn intensely, the consequences for the watersheds can be severe. The loss of the forest cover that regulates the flow and quality of the water, and the aftermath of erosion, flooding, and debris flows that can foul reservoirs and damage water infrastructure. A severe fire in a critical watershed can degrade the water supply for a large population for years. So the tinderbox of dead trees is not merely a threat to the forests, but a threat to the homes, the infrastructure, and above all the water of the American West, a danger that reaches from the remote mountains into the daily lives of millions. Why it is so hard to fix. Faced with a tinderbox of this magnitude, one might ask why the region does not simply remove the dead trees, clearing away the fuel before it can burn. The answer reveals the profound difficulty of confronting a problem of this scale, a difficulty rooted in the sheer number of dead trees, the vastness and inaccessibility of the terrain, and the limited resources available to address them. The idea of removing tens of millions of dead trees from across the mountains and forests of the West is, when examined closely, a task of almost unimaginable scale, and one that current resources and methods cannot come close to accomplishing. Consider what removing the dead trees would actually require. The dead trees number in the tens and hundreds of millions, spread across enormous areas of rugged, often remote and inaccessible mountain terrain, much of it far from roads and difficult to reach. Removing them would require an immense effort of labor, equipment, and money, cutting and hauling the trees out of the forests, an operation that would have to be conducted across millions of acres of difficult country. The cost would be enormous, far beyond the resources currently devoted to the problem, and even a massive effort could address only a fraction of the total. There are also complications around what to do with the removed wood, much of which has limited commercial value, and around the environmental considerations of large-scale removal operations. The result is that only a small portion of the dead trees can realistically be removed, typically prioritized around the highest value areas, near communities, along critical infrastructure and evacuation routes, in the places where the danger to people is greatest. But across the vast remainder of the affected forests, the dead trees stand and fall and accumulate. Beyond the reach of any feasible removal effort, this is the hard reality of the tinderbox. It is simply too large to clear away. The scale of the mortality has outstripped the capacity to respond, leaving vast reservoirs of dead fuel that cannot be removed and must instead be managed as best as possible, with the underlying danger largely remaining. The West cannot simply cut its way out of the tinderbox. The problem is too big, the terrain too vast, and the resources too limited. Living with the tinderbox, if the dead trees cannot simply be removed, then the West must find ways to live with the tinderbox and to manage its dangers as effectively as possible, and this is where the response to the crisis is focused, on a set of strategies aimed at reducing the risk where it matters most, and at building resilience in the face of a danger that cannot be eliminated. These strategies represent a pragmatic recognition that the total problem cannot be solved, but that its worst consequences can be mitigated through careful, prioritized effort. The first and most important focus is on protecting the communities most at risk, through the creation of defensible space and fuel reduction around homes and towns. By clearing dead trees and reducing fuel in the immediate vicinity of communities, in the wildland-urban interface where people and forest meet, it is possible to give those communities a better chance of surviving a fire and to give firefighters a better chance of defending them. This targeted work, concentrated where the human stakes are highest, is far more feasible than trying to clear the entire forest, and it can make a real difference in protecting lives and homes. A related focus is on protecting critical infrastructure and evacuation routes, clearing the dead trees that threaten power lines and the roads that people would need to escape a fire. Beyond the direct removal of fuel, there is an emphasis on preparedness and response. on maintaining the firefighting capacity to attack fires quickly before they can grow, on the warning and evacuation systems that protect people when fires do come, and on helping communities prepare themselves through fire-resistant building and landscaping. There is also a longer-term dimension involving efforts to restore forests to a healthier and more resilient condition over time. Through thinning and managed fire that can reduce fuel loads and make the forests less prone to the catastrophic fires and the mass mortality that created the tinderbox in the first place. None of these strategies can eliminate the danger, but together they represent the practical response to a problem too large to solve outright. A way of living with the tinderbox and reducing its worst harms while the underlying reservoir of dead fuel remains across the landscape. The vicious cycle of fire and death, one of the most troubling aspects of the tinderbox, is the way it feeds on itself, creating a vicious cycle in which the conditions that killed the trees and the fires that the dead trees fuel reinforce one another, deepening the crisis with each turn. Understanding this cycle is essential to grasping why the problem has grown so severe and why it is so difficult to escape. It begins with the warming climate, which drives the drought that weakens the trees and supercharges the beetles that kill them, producing the mass mortality that creates the tinderbox. The dead trees then fuel intense fires, and those fires, in turn, feed back into the very conditions that started the cycle. When the dead forests burn in intense fires, they release enormous quantities of carbon into the atmosphere, the carbon that the trees had stored over their lifetimes, and this contributes to the warming of the climate that is driving the whole crisis. The intense fires also devastate the forests further, killing surviving trees and transforming the landscape in ways that can make it harder for healthy forests to regrow, sometimes converting forests to shrubland or grassland that carries its own fire risks. The loss of the forests reduces the landscape's capacity to store carbon and to provide the ecological services that help regulate the local environment. And the warming continues, driving more drought, more beetle activity, more tree death, more fuel, and more fire. Each element of the cycle amplifies the others. Warming drives death, death drives fire, fire drives warming, and around it goes. A self-reinforcing loop that has helped push the western forests into their current crisis. Breaking this cycle is extraordinarily difficult because it would require addressing the underlying warming that drives it, a challenge of global scale, even as the immediate consequences continue to accumulate on the ground in the form of ever more dead trees and ever more dangerous fire seasons. The tinderbox is not a static problem, but a dynamic one, embedded in a cycle that tends to deepen it over time, and this is a large part of why it represents such a formidable and enduring challenge for the American West. A forest transformed. Beyond the immediate danger of fire, the mass death of the trees represents a profound transformation of the western forests themselves, an ecological change of historic proportions whose consequences will unfold for generations, and it is worth pausing to appreciate the magnitude of what is being lost and changed. The forests that are dying are not just collections of trees, but complex living ecosystems, home to countless species of animals and plants, providers of clean water and air, storehouses of carbon, and landscapes of immense beauty and value to the people who live among them and visit them. The death of tens of millions of trees is the unraveling of these ecosystems on a vast scale. A change that touches everything from the wildlife that depends on the forest to the character of the landscape itself. Some of this change may be, in the long view of ecology, part of a natural process of disturbance and renewal, for forests have always experienced cycles of death and regrowth, and fire and insects have always played roles in shaping them. But the current scale and pace of the mortality, driven by a rapidly warming climate, may be pushing beyond the bounds of what the forest can readily recover from, raising the possibility of more permanent transformations. In some places, the combination of drought, beetles, and severe fire may prevent the forest from regrowing as they were, leading to lasting shifts in the landscape. From forest to other kinds of vegetation, or to forests of different and perhaps sparser character. These changes carry consequences for everything the forests provide: the water, the wildlife habitat, the carbon storage, the recreation and beauty and sense of place that the great forests of the West represent to the region and the nation. The tinderbox of dead trees is thus not only a fire hazard, but the visible face of a deeper transformation. The reshaping of the western forests under the pressure of a changing climate, a change whose full consequences are only beginning to be understood and whose effects will be felt for a very long time. To stand among the gray skeletons of a dead forest is to witness not just a fuel hazard, but the passing of a landscape, the death of an ecosystem that took centuries to grow and may not return in the form it had. The people who live among the dead trees it is worth pausing to consider the human experience of living amid this transformation. Because for the residents of the forested communities of the West, the tinderbox is not an abstraction, but a daily reality, a presence that shapes their lives in ways that outsiders rarely appreciate. To live in a town surrounded by dead and dying forest is to live with a constant, low-grade awareness of danger, to look out at hillsides of gray skeletons and know that they represent an enormous store of fuel that could, under the wrong conditions, become a catastrophe, bearing down on your home. It is to watch the forest you may have known and loved for a lifetime turn from green to gray, to grieve the loss of the living landscape, even as you fear the fire that its death has made possible. For these communities, the dead forests bring practical burdens as well as fears. There is the danger of the falling trees themselves, the snags that can come down on homes, roads, and power lines. There is the constant work of clearing dead trees from around properties, an expensive and never-ending task. There is the anxiety of each approaching fire season, the watching of the weather and the wind, the readiness to evacuate at a moment's notice. There is the disruption when fires do come, the smoke that fills the air and fouls the lungs, the evacuations that upend lives, the losses when homes and communities are damaged or destroyed. And there is the deeper, harder-to-name burden of living in a landscape that is visibly sick, of raising families and building lives in the shadow of dying forests and the fires they portend. The people of the West's forested communities are on the front line of the tinderbox, bearing its dangers and its losses most directly. And their experience is a reminder that behind the vast numbers of dead trees are real human lives, lived in the presence of a transformed and threatening landscape, adapting as best they can to a reality that their parents and grandparents never had to face. The warning in the dead forests. In the end, the tinderbox of dead trees across the American West stands as a stark warning, a visible and tangible manifestation of the forces reshaping the region and the planet, and it carries lessons that reach far beyond the immediate danger of fire. The tens and hundreds of millions of dead trees are, in a sense, a record written across the landscape of what a warming climate can do. A drought that would not break, a plague of beetles unleashed by warming winters, a mass death of forests on a scale rarely seen, and the vast reservoir of fire that death has created. They are a warning of the interconnected nature of the crisis, of the way that warming drives drought, that drives death, that drives fire, that drives more warming. A cascade of consequences flowing from a single underlying cause. The response to the tinderbox, the targeted fuel reduction, the protection of communities and watersheds, the building of resilience, the long work of forest restoration represents the necessary and pragmatic effort to manage a danger that cannot be eliminated, to protect what can be protected, and to reduce the worst harms while the underlying reservoir of dead fuel remains. This work matters enormously, and it can save lives, homes, and watersheds even as the larger problem persists. But the dead forests also point beyond themselves to the deeper challenge of the warming that created them. A challenge that the removal of dead trees and the protection of communities cannot by themselves resolve. The ultimate lesson of the tinderbox is that the health of the forests and the safety of the communities that live among them are bound up with the broader trajectory of the climate, and that the mass death of the western forests is a sign of a system under profound stress. For now, the dead trees stand and fall across the mountains, an immense and historic tinderbox, and the West must live with them, manage them, and brace for the fires they make possible, while the deeper forces that created them continue to press upon the land. The gray forests on the mountainsides are beautiful in their stark way, but they are also a warning. And the wisdom of the moment lies in heeding it, in doing the hard practical work of protecting people from the fire the dead trees hold, and in understanding what the dying forests are telling us about the changing world in which they and we must find a way to endure.